For most of the war, Belarus played the role Moscow needed most, a rear platform that was close to Kyiv, politically loyal to the Kremlin, and protected by the assumption that Ukraine would hesitate to strike it directly. Russian forces had already used Belarusian territory at the start of the full-scale invasion. Russian aircraft, missiles, logistics routes, and troops had all benefited from access to the Belarusian side of the border. Minsk did not have to send its own army into Ukraine to become part of the war. It simply had to keep the gates open. That is why the latest shift from Alexander Lukashenko matters. The Belarusian leader, long seen as Vladimir Putin's most loyal ally, suddenly changed his tone in mid-June. After years of aggressive language toward Kyiv, he publicly apologized to Volodymyr Zelensky and declared that Belarus would not enter a military confrontation with Ukraine. On the surface, this sounded like diplomacy, but the deeper story is military pressure. Lukashenko was not speaking from a position of confidence. He was speaking from inside a shrinking strategic space, where every move toward Russia brings him closer to becoming a target, and every move away from Russia risks angering the man who has kept him in power. The most important sentence in this entire episode was not the apology itself. It was Lukashenko's admission that Ukraine knows Belarus extremely well. In his own words, Belarus has become an open book to Kyiv. That phrase tells us more than any formal statement could. Because shortly before this sudden change in tone, Ukraine had already sent a very direct message. In late May 2026, Robert Magyar Brovdy, the commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, warned that Ukraine had already identified 500 important targets inside Belarus. These were not symbolic targets. They were the kinds of assets that allow a state to support a war. Air bases, command centers, logistics hubs, railway nodes, fuel infrastructure, ammunition facilities, radar sites, repair workshops, military-industrial plants, underground command posts. For years, Belarus had acted as if Russia's nuclear umbrella and conventional military power gave Minsk a shield. That assumption is now much weaker than it was in 2022. Ukraine's ability to strike deep into enemy territory has changed the entire equation. In the early stages of the war, Belarus could threaten Ukraine because geography favored Minsk and Moscow. The Belarusian border sits close to Kyiv. It gives Russia potential access to northern Ukraine, to Chernihiv, to Sumy, and to the supply corridors that connect Ukraine to Poland and the wider NATO support network. But by 2026, Ukraine is no longer the same military actor it was at the beginning of the invasion. Its intelligence network has expanded, its drone forces have matured, its long-range strike systems have multiplied, its understanding of Russian and Belarusian logistics has become far more precise. That is why Lukashenko's fear is not difficult to understand. If Ukraine has the coordinates, the surveillance architecture, and the strike systems, then Belarus is no longer just a rear area. It is a target set. The first category of targets is obvious: airfields. Belarusian air bases such as Machulishchi, Baranovichi, Lida, and Babruisk are strategically valuable because they sit inside the broader military geography of the war. These locations are close enough to matter, deep enough to support Russian operations, and important enough to appear on any serious Ukrainian target map. The second category is logistics. Russia's war depends on movement, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, vehicles, personnel, and repair capacity. Belarus's railway network gives Moscow a logistical platform close to Ukraine's northern border. In a war where Ukraine has repeatedly targeted bridges, depots, rail hubs, and supply corridors, that network would be one of the first things Kyiv would study. The third category is energy. The Myzyr refinery is not just another industrial site. In this war, fuel is a battlefield resource. Tanks, trucks, artillery supply vehicles, engineering equipment, missile transporters, and drone launch units all depend on fuel. If Belarusian energy infrastructure helps sustain Russia's war machine, then it becomes part of the military equation. The same logic applies to Naftan. Together, the Naftan and Myzyr refineries have a combined annual capacity of 24 million tons. They process Russian crude and move refined products into Russian markets and, through Russian ports, into wider export routes. As Ukraine's campaign against Russian refineries has intensified, Belarus has become more important as a substitute supplier. That creates a paradox for Lukashenko. Every successful Ukrainian strike against Russian oil infrastructure makes Belarus more useful to Moscow. But every step that makes Belarus more useful to Moscow also makes Belarus more vulnerable to Kyiv. In the first 5 months of 2026, Belarusian gasoline exports to Russia reportedly rose 13-fold compared with the previous year. Diesel exports tripled. That is not a neutral commercial detail. In wartime, fuel supply is strategic support. So while Lukashenko may claim he is keeping Belarus out of the war, the physical infrastructure of his state tells a different story. Belarus is not sending large formations of its own troops across the border, but it is helping Russia in other ways, by enabling drone routes, supporting logistics, and supplying fuel. And that brings us to the drone war. Near the Belarusian border, Russia has been building a network of drone launch facilities. Satellite images analyzed by Radio Svoboda's Belarusian service and independent OSINT researchers have turned up at least 5 such sites in recent months, scattered through Russia's Bryansk, Oryol, and Smolensk regions, some sitting barely a few dozen kilometers from Belarusian soil. None is larger than the Symbolova complex in Oryol, which more than doubled in footprint over the spring of 2026 and now spans upward of 5 square kilometers. Russian state broadcaster Zvezda has called it the world's biggest drone port, and once you look at what's actually on the ground there, the label starts to make sense. Open source analysts have counted 93 garages, 15 large hangars, and 20 maintenance bays on the site, alongside 8 fixed launch ramps and a 2.5-kilometer runway built specifically for mass launches. The storage capacity alone runs to more than 500 drones at once, and satellite imagery has already confirmed at least 175 sitting in shelters. By May 2026, something new showed up on the satellite images. 85-meter rail launch systems built for the Juran 5, a jet-powered successor to the Shahed that flies faster and is considerably harder to shoot down. 10 of these new ramps appeared within a single month, and construction has not let up since. This matters because the location of these facilities is not accidental. Russia places them near Belarus because Belarusian airspace gives Russian drones operational advantages. Drones flying toward Kyiv, Chernihiv, Sumy, and central Ukraine can use routes that shorten the time Ukraine has to detect, track, and destroy them. If Belarus does not warn, intercept, or shoot them down, then silence becomes cooperation. That is the key point. Neutrality is not just a statement. In military terms, neutrality has behavior. If Russian drones pass through Belarusian airspace and Belarus does nothing, that behavior supports Russian operations. The consequences do not stop at Ukraine. In 2025, 19 Russian drones flying through Belarus entered Polish airspace, and Warsaw invoked NATO Article 4 for the first time in history. That event showed that Belarus's role as a drone corridor does not only threaten Ukraine, it also creates risk for NATO's eastern flank. So Belarus now sits at the center of 3 overlapping pressures. First, Russia wants Belarus to remain a useful platform. Second, Ukraine wants to deter Belarus from deeper participation. Third, NATO sees Belarus less as a buffer and more as an extension of Russia's military system. This is why Lukashenko's apology cannot be separated from the military map. If Belarus were strong, protected, and politically independent, he would not need to soften his language. But Belarus is none of those things. Its army is small compared with the scale of the war. Much of its equipment is old. Its units lack the combat experience that Ukrainian forces have gained over years of intense fighting. And without Russian help, Belarus cannot create a serious retaliatory threat against Ukraine. That is the reality behind the words. Lukashenko's problem is not simply that Ukraine can hit Belarus. It is that Belarus cannot hit back at the same level without dragging itself deeper into Russia's war. And then there is the border. The Belarus-Ukraine border is roughly 1,085 kilometers long. But in military terms, once operational depth, logistics routes, defensive belts, and approach corridors are included, the problem becomes much larger. It creates a defensive zone of about 1,500 kilometers. If Belarus opened a new front, Ukraine would have to defend that space. But Belarus would also expose its own territory to the same logic. This is why the Northern Front remains useful to Putin even without a full invasion. Russia may not need Belarus to launch a major offensive. The threat itself has value. If Ukraine has to keep brigades in the north, those brigades are not available in Donetsk, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, or other active sectors. Every unit guarding the Belarusian border is one less unit that can reinforce the main front. That may be Putin's real calculation. A full assault on Kyiv would be the most dramatic option, but also the least likely. Russia already tried that in 2022 and failed. Moving tens of thousands of troops into Belarus would be difficult to hide. Ukraine's border defenses are stronger now. The frontier has been fortified and mined. Ukrainian drones would slow any assault column to a crawl. The technology of the war has changed too much for a repeat of 2022 to look realistic. Still, the Kremlin appears to be studying northern options. Zelensky has already pointed to intelligence suggesting Russia is drafting attack plans toward Chernihiv and Kyiv, launched either from Belarusian soil or from the Bryansk region. A claim Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky backed up, confirming the general staff is running the numbers on a northern offensive. Sources cited put the Kremlin's planning at 5 separate scenarios. On one end sits the most probable option, carving out a shallow buffer zone, 10 to 20 kilometers deep inside the Chernihiv region. On the other end, barely considered, is a straight assault on Kyiv itself. Everything in between is built around the same goal: keep Ukrainian brigades pinned in the north, away from Donetsk, and grind down morale through sustained pressure. There's also a manpower angle. Zelensky says Russia is assembling a fresh mobilization wave of 100,000 troops, with a portion earmarked for these northern operations. Ukraine is not ignoring the threat. In Volyn Oblast, which borders both Belarus and Poland, the military authorities have begun strengthening defenses. This region matters because it lies near the supply corridors that carry Western military and humanitarian aid into Ukraine. The regional deputy military commander, Romaniuk, said anti-drone nets would be installed over roads near the Belarusian border. On the ground, that means new engineering barriers, reinforced defensive positions, and upgraded surveillance, all going in at once. For now, officials describe the threat level as low. Roughly 1,900 troops sit on the Belarusian side of the line, nowhere near what Russia would need to mount a serious operation there. But Ukraine is preparing because the northern threat does not have to be immediate to be useful to Moscow. It only has to be credible enough to force Kyiv to plan around it. That is where deterrence becomes central. Ukraine's message to Minsk is no longer defensive in the old sense. It is not only saying, "Do not attack us." It is saying, "If you help Russia attack us, your own critical infrastructure will be exposed." This is the shift that has changed Lukashenko's behavior. Magyar's warning about 500 pre-programmed military targets was meant to make that risk concrete. It turned Belarus from an abstract rear area into a mapped battle space. Bases, command centers, logistics nodes, refineries, and rail infrastructure were all placed inside a Ukrainian deterrence framework. The weapons behind that threat are not imaginary. Ukraine has developed a hybrid long-range strike architecture involving drones, domestically produced missiles, and Western-supplied systems. Its drone swarms can operate across hundreds of kilometers, with low radar signatures and increasing resistance to electronic warfare. Upgraded Neptune missiles can reportedly reach more than 1,000 kilometers. The FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile is described as having a range of 3,000 kilometers, putting the entire territory of Belarus within reach. Western-supplied ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles, with many restrictions reportedly lifted, add another layer against protected airfields and ammunition depots. For Lukashenko, that means Belarus's strategic depth is no longer enough. Distance no longer guarantees safety, borders no longer guarantee protection, Russia's presence no longer guarantees immunity. This military pressure has also changed the diplomatic field. Zelensky's policy toward Belarus has hardened noticeably over the last 6 months. 2 new sanctions packages have gone out against Lukashenko's inner circle, and Zelensky has now met opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya twice, first in Vilnius, then again in Kyiv. None of that was symbolic. Kyiv has effectively stopped treating Lukashenko as a neutral neighbor to be managed carefully, and started treating his government as an arm of Moscow's war machine, while elevating the Belarusian opposition to the status of a real political counterpart. Zelensky has gone further still, stating plainly that Ukraine is prepared to take preventive action against Belarus if needed, framing it as a matter of strengthening Ukraine's own defense. Even Paris got involved. Acting at Zelensky's request, Emmanuel Macron picked up the phone to Lukashenko, their first call in over 4 years, to spell out exactly what deeper involvement would cost Belarus. The fact that the call happened at all says something. Europe's read on Belarus has shifted dramatically since 2022. Before the full-scale invasion, Belarus could still be described by some as a buffer state. Now it is increasingly viewed as part of Russia's military system. It's a shift worth sitting with. Applying pressure on Minsk simply doesn't cost Kyiv much anymore, so there's little reason for Ukraine to hold back. It's a complete role reversal from 3 years ago, when Lukashenko was the one issuing threats. Today, he's the one reaching for talks and trying to cool things down. Few signals make the success of Ukraine's deterrence clearer than that. But deterrence does not mean Lukashenko is free. He may fear Ukraine, but he still depends on Putin. This dependence didn't start with the current crisis. Back in 2020, when hundreds of thousands of Belarusians flooded the streets after a disputed election, it was Putin's backing, political cover, security guarantees, intelligence help, diplomatic shielding that kept Lukashenko in power at all. The aftermath reshaped Belarusian politics. Opposition figures jailed or driven abroad. Independent outlets shuttered, and Lukashenko's grip on power now resting almost entirely on Moscow's continued protection. His economic dependence is just as serious. EU and US sanctions damaged Belarusian export revenue. Potash supplies were cut off from European markets. Airspace restrictions and financial pressure narrowed Minsk's room for maneuver. The more isolated Belarus became from the West, the more dependent it became on Russia. Putin understands this dependence and uses it, but Lukashenko also understands the danger of obeying Putin too completely. Direct entry into the war would carry a steep price. It would almost certainly torpedo Belarus's emerging dialogue with Washington. Talks that have raised the possibility of sanctions relief tied to prisoner swaps, floated a potential Lukashenko visit to the US, and even nudged Washington into pressuring Poland and Lithuania over potash transit. That back channel may be Lukashenko's only real lifeline that doesn't run through Moscow, and going to war would almost certainly sever it. The European Union would tighten sanctions. Belarus's economy would become even more dependent on Russia. And Russia, already under pressure from a wartime economy, may not have unlimited capacity to subsidize Minsk. Then Ukraine's deterrence would come into play. Refineries would become targets. Military bases would become targets. Infrastructure would become targets. And the most dangerous consequence for Lukashenko may not be military at all. It may be domestic. Belarusian casualties, economic shock, and a new wave of public anger could reopen the same political wound that nearly destroyed his regime in 2020. Lukashenko knows how fragile that foundation is because he has already survived one crisis on it. That is why his language has become contradictory. Listen to him in Grodno, and you can hear the split. In one breath, Belarus wants no part of a war in Ukraine. Minutes later, Belarus stands ready to defend Russia if needed. He floats talks with Zelensky one week, then runs joint nuclear drills with Russia, and keeps the Oreshnik missile system parked on Belarusian soil the next. None of that is an accident or a slip of the tongue. It's a leader trying to hold two completely different audiences at once, telling each exactly what it wants to hear. To Ukraine and the West, he wants to say, Belarus does not want direct war. To Moscow, he wants to say, Belarus is still loyal. But the space between those two messages is getting smaller. Lukashenko is trapped between the power that protects him and the power that can now punish him. Putin still holds the political and economic keys to his survival, but Ukraine now holds the military leverage to make deeper involvement extremely costly. That is the real meaning of the apology. It was not simply a diplomatic gesture. It was a signal from a regime that has realized the war has moved closer to home. Belarus can still help Russia. It can still host systems, enable routes, support fuel flows, and maintain pressure on Ukraine's northern border. But it can no longer do these things without risk. For the first time, Minsk is not only a platform for Russian power, it is part of Ukraine's target map. And that is why the Belarusian front has changed direction.